In just a few years, Russia has moved from a narrative about brotherly peoples to genocidal rhetoric and actions in Ukraine. How was historical memory manipulated to make this happen? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce, and do also consider becoming a patron to support the work we do, or you can now just buy me a coffee. Dr. Jade McGlynn is a Russia specialist and experienced researcher. She is Senior Research Associate Non-Resident at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She is also a Research Fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Jade is a polyglot political analyst with experience of living and working in several European countries, and has a PhD in Russian from the University of Oxford, with academic fellowships from Leverhulme, AHRC, Marie Curie, and Carnegie, and has held positions in Russia, the UK, and the US. She is also the author of scholarly works, as well as many media articles and two fantastic books, Russia's War and Memory Makers. Now, in our previous interview, we really touched upon Russia's War and the topics associated with that. We did start to delve into memory politics, but really that is going to form the focus of today's conversation. Jade, I'm delighted to welcome you back.
Thank you for having me back.
And you have been something, I would say, of a superstar over the last year. You're doing a lot of talks. You're doing a lot of events. First of all, how are you? Because you've been out to Ukraine, you're doing a vast amount of stuff. It must be fairly tiring, as well as I would say, the emotional pressure of seeing these horrific events unfold.
I think this, I don't often get asked that question. I think, and I don't really think about it, but I think maybe they're linked in the sense that you go and you see the sacrifices that other people make, and it really doesn't feel that hard by comparison. But I mean, I am tired, but that's mainly because my children don't sleep. that's not a geopolitical issue. That's a child related one.
In fact, yeah, possibly the events are a break, less exhausting, having being a similar sort of situation. I don't have a baby, but having small people that require entertainment. But I ask this because, speaking to Ukrainians, it's they put a brave face on things, but it is extremely exhausting and hard on the nerves. And I think that's what I find most impressive about Ukrainians, who are really pushing on civil society, who are crowdsourcing and funding. And what I also find fascinating as well is that so many academics have moved, I guess, from a sort of, I won't say sort of, the sort of ivory tower, but many people have moved into more of an activist phase over the last year and a half. Have you noticed that, amongst colleagues and in academia?
I have, and I think that insofar as it relates to public engagement, that's a wonderful thing. But I think that sometimes there are some blurred lines when it comes to activism. I think if you're making an argument, a policy argument that you've arrived at on the basis of your research, obviously that's completely normal. But I think it's difficult. And I mean, I'm not saying that there's an easy way to do this, and I'm certainly not saying I've always done it correctly, because I know I haven't. And I do struggle with it sometimes, because if there's information that is not necessarily that helpful to Ukraine's case, you kind of do sort of have a double think about whether or not to say it. But I think ultimately then the issue is, well, how best to frame it, how best to explain it, how best to contextualize it, rather than to just sort of not say it or to shout people down for other arguments. So whilst definitely not doing it perfectly, very far from, I do try to struggle a bit against that, which isn't to say that, we have to just be analysts. It's reasonable to come to a conclusion based on your analysis, right? I mean, we're not just analysts, but yeah, sometimes sometimes I think it's difficult, particularly for the public, because it's not always clear what somebody's personal position and what somebody's advocacy. Like, I have lots of opinions on what should happen to the UK economy, but nobody should listen to me because I don't know anything about economics. I think they're right, but they're not based on research. So I think that's the other issue, is just because you're an expert in, I don't know, Russian 18th century history, or it really doesn't then give you a right to start talking about what Ukrainians should do, or vice versa.
Mm. Well, we won't touch upon realist geopolitics, but I think there's a touch of that there as well. What you've said there, I think, brings us very neatly into this idea of history. And when I was sort of doing A-level in university, we tended to think of history as this objective process. Now, I know in sort of studying it can be relatively subjective, and every generation even not only reinterprets events, but different sort of I would say fashions in the study of history and the way it's examined come in, from the great person politics down to much more looking at changes in technology, society, and so on. So there are these sort of changes. There's no such thing as objective history, but we had a sense that it's disjointed from the present. In some ways, it's quite a passive discipline. It's something you can examine it in the past, and yes, it has some implications for the present, but they're not, they're not sort of overwhelming. When we look at Russia and we look at the manipulations of history, and I think what you just said there about having to be sensitive, that's because propaganda uses aspects of history, some truthful aspects of history, and then warps them and turns them and weaponizes to them. I mean, what sense do you have as you started to sort of realize in researching merrymakers that history is something very, very different in the hands of, say, the Kremlin than it is in say, the UK?
I mean, I was interested in it, and then I started to research it and do the PhD, because it probably took me about 9 years altogether, the book, in terms of the research that's in it. So it was because I was just watching the news. I only had Russian channels because I didn't watch TV very much, but we had a TV, and we only had Russian channels on it, and I lived in Moscow. Obviously, it wasn't in the UK. And all of the references during the Revolution of Dignity, to, oh, look, the Banderovцы, which is used in Russian to mean basically Nazi collaborators, is a reference to the wartime nationalist leader, Stepan Bandera, some of whose followers collaborated with Nazis. Mainly they fought against the Soviet Union for Ukrainian independence. So, and perhaps we can come back to the issue of Bandera, because it's a pretty good example of the topic you were just talking about, that sort of historical awkwardness when there is an issue, to put it very euphemistically, with Bandera, but it's about understanding how Russia uses it. And so that's really what sparked the interest. And then, as I sort of, first of all, I was interested in, I suppose, from a language point of view, or how actually the narratives were produced. And I was very interested in the way that this really wasn't about history, this was about memory. This wasn't about establishing the past. It was about, say, using memory and recreating memory in order to influence people's views of the present. And so, I mean, I found it really fascinating, but the more I dug into it, the more I discovered. And then I really ended up writing a book, not so much about the use of history and propaganda as about the creation, really, of a post-Soviet identity that is formed around memory, and ideas of defending memory, and the idea that Russian memory is under attack, and that Russia has a special insight into history. And just finally, I would add that I wouldn't say it is so different, actually, to the way that some politicians in the UK do use history, in particular during Boris Johnson's time. There were some quite, it seems to have calmed down since, but there were, and of course during Brexit, we had all of the references to the Battle of Britain, so we can stand alone. I mean, it felt very similar. The difference really is one of intensity, and also one of democracy, really, because anybody can go on TV and criticize Winston Churchill. Well, not anyone, but as you know, people can go on TV and criticize Winston Churchill. That doesn't mean there isn't a bit of a Winston Churchill cult. That doesn't mean that people won't shout you down if you start talking about certain things that happened with miners in Wales, etc. But you can do that. That's not an issue, and people frequently do. So there are two differences, I suppose.
And I think that's the aspect that took me a long time to kind of realize, that history or memory politics, I think, as you say, is a better description. It's alive, it's potent, but it's also lethal and malleable. It makes me think a little bit of those Stalin photographs where, you know, you've got Trotsky, whoever, in one photograph, and then, you know, a few years later, they've been expertly removed from the picture. Similar things happening to Prigozhin now. This sense that history is not just something you can pick and choose the bits you like and shout down the bits you don't, but that actually anything that happened in the past is open for debate still. You know, you can prosecute somebody who's dead, you can wipe people out of the picture, you can change facts to weaponize them and suit your purposes. I know that's a little Pomerantian, perhaps, in terms of the question, but it feels that history is something that is dangerously malleable. Do you get that sense as well?
Well, I think history is dangerously malleable, but I think in a way we've seen different approaches. So if we think about, for example, just because you referenced Peter Pomerantz's work, I think there are a few different sort of processes going on. So for a start, this is something that's happening really around the world. In part, it's because, you know, the information revolution sparked by the internet has obviously led to a process of democratization of memory. So you have that increased access to information, to sources, to competing narratives, and then you have a greater variety of historical interpretation. And whilst it's definitely a good thing that history has stopped just being an elite-driven project, you were speaking earlier about your own kind of investigations into your family links. This is clearly a wonderful thing. But at the same point, it's also the flip side is you get the equation of expertise with, no, I don't think so. I did some research on, you know, a dark corner of the internet, and you're wrong, because what about X? I mean, that's clearly negative. And I think that both clearly existed before, but both of these elements have become intensified consequences, I suppose, of the democratization of information, if we put it that way. And then it comes to questions of who owns history. What is history? Is it just, you know, in an extreme postmodernist version, like a set of competing narratives? Can history be fixed? Must it always be subject to revision? I mean, these are big questions that scholars will probably always debate, but they're also very deeply polarizing, because often people's version of history is very closely interconnected with their identity. You know, and that's not just their national identity, but sometimes, you know, their familial, their family identity, their personal identity. So which version of history you sort of profess, and each nation often has its own specificities, even if there are sort of variable specificities. It's often quite reflective of how you see the world, of your identity, and of I suppose your truth. So we were talking about Churchill previously. Anybody who did choose to focus on, perhaps this is just me, so I'd be interested in your opinion, but anybody who did choose to just focus on or to bring up Churchill's actions or decisions in Wales with the miners, I would immediately be able to make certain assumptions that I think would probably end up being correct about where they stand on quite a lot of other issues, including on the left-right spectrum. So it's not just about, it's also a way of sort of explaining who you are. So we had the anniversary of 9/11, and you also had a lot of people reminding that it was the anniversary of the CIA-backed, the US-backed coup, which led to the death of Allende. And again, you can kind of quite easily tell who, you can have a good guess as to where the people who are bringing up the coup in Chile you can have a good guess about where they might stand on certain issues. So defending that version of history and your right to bring it up is often really, when you get down to it, about defending who you are, your values, against those who would seek to deny you, which is why then when we get into the issue of falsification and who is falsifying history, and when you don't have that democratic element where these debates, I suppose, since history is being used as politics, where you don't have any of that political then debate around history, where it sort of refines and ideally that's what discussion should do. And you have the worst of both cases in Russia, where you don't have any debate. Indeed, there are many memory laws against it. Plus, you have an incredibly efficient state apparatus for spreading its version of the narrative, and a very securitized notion of history. I mean, it's in pretty much all of the doctrines that, the West is trying to destroy our historical memory. Well, that's then when that combination, I suppose, of the modern, of the postmodern, but also the authoritarian dictatorial approach is a pretty ugly cocktail.
I guess that gets to the crux of it, isn't it? Is memory and identity. Where certain historical facts or certain scenarios, or as you've, I think, painted the picture here, it's less about individual facts, it's more about almost the ecosystem in which you inhabit, or the narrative or story you tell yourself about your country. When that becomes a key part of who you perceive yourself to be, any inconvenient fact, any detail that perhaps makes that picture more complex, or even denies certain aspects of it, that's perhaps where I guess we get cult thinking coming in. And it could be you're attacking a religious identity or a national identity, or in the case of Russia, you've got these fused together. It's almost like a toxic mix of the religious and the national identities all sort of fused together. And do you think the Kremlin understands this? Do you think they're really using that? Is it a key part of the weaponization of memory?
So there are 2 points there. So I'll come to why history, like why they use history as in such an extreme and intense way, particularly since 2012. It's always been there, but it became much more intensive after 2012. But I think there's one point, if it's okay, in the first part of your question that I'd like to pick up, which is, it goes on from what we were talking about before, and Pomerantz's work on the idea that nothing was true. You have this sort of nihilistic attitude towards objectivity that often still people see as very typical of Russian media and Russian disinformation, especially in those targeted at foreign audiences. But if we look domestically, I think the role of the relationship with truth there is not so much an outright rejection of truth and evidence, even as concepts, though it might be a rejection of what you or I see as truth or evidence, but it's more like an embrace of what I call an allegorical understanding of, or approach to truth, which picks up on what you were saying. Because if we use an example, so the story of the legend of Pamfilov's 28, where it had already been very widely dismissed as pure fantasy, for example, even in the 70s. So the Afanasyev report, which concluded it was just nonsense. And then Brezhnev spoke out to discredit the report and any attendant rumors. And of course, that approach is going to be pretty effective in the USSR because of its information space. But it also reflects a concern with making objective truth appear to align with what the government wanted to pretend was true. Now, if we take the Putin-era Russian government and Putin himself, by contrast, they display generally considerably less concern about aligning their version of history with that of a plausible version of history of that of objective fact. So with Pamfilov 28, the head of the State Archive in 2016, Sergei Mironenko, was sacked after he published and promoted evidence that the legend was demonstrably untrue. And yet Medinsky, who was at the center of this dispute, and it was at that point the Minister of Culture and is now the presidential aide on matters of history and memory, Medinsky, even though he was central to sort of firing Mironenko, admitted that the Pamphilus 28 story was objectively false. And to him, it wasn't important whether it happened. What was important was that it represents truth. It functions as this allegory, like an allegorical truth. And he argued that absolute objectivity did not exist. So we see that 90s sort of shadow still there. But then a new element, that myths were also facts. And that there were no definite events, only interpretations of history. There are no historical conceptions that are the one and only truth or genuinely objective. And he continued that the legend has become a material force, more terrible and more wonderful than any fact from any real battle. Now, if we cut through all of this, which is a bit fluffy, what he's basically saying is, it doesn't matter whether or not it happened. What matters is that that story represents the bravery and the heroism and the self-sacrifice of Soviet fighters during World War II. And for that reason, the myth must be embraced and shared. And that appeals to people. And I think, in the same way that not many Brits will thank you if you say, well, technically you didn't stand on your own because you had this empire and you were getting XYZ. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to people. People, they won't remember it. That won't impact their memory. That's historically true. But in terms of the memory that many British people, particularly of a certain age, have of the cultural memory, I mean, obviously it's not many people with a living memory of World War II, is that, okay, Britain stood alone, and, the sort of bulldog spirit and all of these other elements. So I think that's sort of one important element. And it also speaks to the second answer. So the answer to the second part of your question, which is why history. And we've seen across those countries where, I don't want to kind of, basically that are post-communist, that lived under sort of Marxist regimes. We've seen that in all of these countries, history has become incredibly politicized. So, for example, of course, with the Institute of National Memory in Poland, and the one in Ukraine has often had quite starkly different positions, though now it has a very nice conciliatory approach, but that's not always been the case. And yeah, so the question of why history is partly linked to that, but it's also to do with the fact that there's really not that many things that could unite Russia. If we think back to to Yeltsin's era, when he goes off in search of a national idea, but he never finds one. And for Russia, it became the notion of, we have this great history, and not only do we have this great history that centers around, the need for a strong state, that Russia's a special civilization, that Russia's a great power with a kind of a mission almost in the world. Not only are we a great nation, but we also have a really specific insight and knowledge of our own history, a self-consciousness. I call it a cultural consciousness, but increasingly I wish I'd call it a self-consciousness, that we can help other countries to discover. And then if we go back to Ukraine, that then sheds some interesting light on that, because it's just that in the Kremlin view that the Ukrainians are mistaken. They just have lost their history. They've been culturally colonized, to use Patrushev's term, by the Americans, by the West, and Russia is returning them to self-consciousness, to their cultural consciousness.
The Russians that have gone wrong. I read that somewhere as well.
Yeah. That's exactly. Yeah, that sums it up. Typical academic two-word. Yeah.
But it's pernicious, isn't it? Because at the start of the war, and I'm stealing words directly from Timothy Schneider here, so apologies, but he's summed it up very well. At the start of the war, there seemed to be the belief in Moscow that these broken Russians, so-called, could be converted. We convert them back, and that's going to be relatively simple. And by the way, there's all these Ukrainians who actually speak Russian. They're actually Russians after all. We're going to liberate them, and that's going to be easy, and blah, blah, blah. As it's gone on, and it's quite clear that Ukrainian identity is complex, the Ukrainian identity does not align with these simplistic notions, that it's not willing kowtow down to power. It's gone from almost an illusion to, well, if we can't fix them, we have to eradicate them. So I think we'll come to this in a minute, because genocide is still unfortunately hotly debated, and the UN and others hold off from using that label. But I think if you watch the evolution of the propaganda and the disenchantment with the progress, so-called, of their special military operation, it's become increasingly genocidal when they realize that not only can they not make any progress on the battlefield, but it's that all of Ukrainian society has really sort of united and is pushing back against that, and they're not going to win. I mean, this is where the mythology of memory hits the sort of the tarmac of reality, and it doesn't quite line up.
No, it's true. I think I think the rhetoric has been pretty genocidal since early on. If we think back to Sergeyev's essay on the need to eradicate Ukraine, it wasn't genocide. Well, I mean, it's a difficult debate, but certainly people really did expect that Ukrainians would just accept it. And I mean, the amount of my Ukrainian friends whose stories are almost identical, with links to Russia, many of whom are ethnically Russian or were born in Russia, or, they're Russians, definitely sort of Russian speakers, just because that's the part of Ukraine I know better. They have so many identical stories of just speaking to their aunt or their sister or their cousin or, their friends in Russia. And they say, you know what, you just sit tight, and it'll be over in a week, and then we'll be kind of living back together. I mean, what do you mean? It said, well, we're liberating you anyway. I mean, that was also something, not everybody said that, but pretty much everybody said, just sit tight. Like, it's not nice, but in a week, it'll all be over. Russia will have won, and then we can just live together again. And they just presumed that is basically what Ukrainians wanted. And even if they didn't want that, they wouldn't be, radically opposed. And it's come as a real shock, I think, to a lot of people, not only people maybe who are pro-war, but to be honest, I think it came as a big shock to lots of people in the West. I personally wasn't shocked, but then it would be a bit worrying if I were that shocked, because I've been studying this in 2014. I was surprised Zelensky stayed. That's what surprised me, but I knew that the resistance would be brutal. But by Zelensky staying, it meant that they didn't have to do what they call a sort of partisan movement or something like this. It meant that it can be
I mean, it's been a journey for me, sort of learning about Ukrainian character. I knew relatively little, and despite following the war since 2014 very closely, the news doesn't always convey, as you say, those sort of characteristics of a people, the resistance, this stubbornness. Oh my God, Ukrainians are wonderfully stubborn, which is again a characteristic you get to understand by speaking to individuals, and the sort of passion and the not wanting to knowingly sort of tell lies. I mean, there's this challenging aspect to Ukrainian character, which is to sort of challenge untruths, challenge people who are trying to impose their truth on you. This instinctive resistance to authority. I guess those who are close to Ukraine would have understood that. But to put it into a historical context, is there also a clash here, a deep clash of the notion of history? One of the most shocking things, that I ever read, I think was AHRC, what is history, and this idea that certain societies have a very different conception of history. In China, with an empire that goes back millennia, there's more of a circular concept of history. There's not necessarily progress. Things just go around and come around, and it's a very different concept. Whereas in the West, we have this idea of progress, much more of a linear concept of history. Things are going to change, things are going to get better, etc. It seems to me that when you look at Ukraine and Russia, you have two different deep conceptions of history. In Russia, there is a fatalism, almost like an inevitable repetition, or a belief that things will inevitably repeat and won't necessarily kind of get better, and perhaps your best days are in the past. Whereas it seems to me that the Ukrainian culture is all about being progressive and forward-looking. And that may not always be the case, and certainly it may have emerged from, you know, the morass of the 90s and the post-Soviet. But do you think there's a deep conception of history that is also competing here on the battlefield and in culture?
So I think you find different conceptions of history in Ukraine. So it's within Ukraine itself. So I wouldn't, because some kind of follow what we might problematically call the Polish model in terms of the structure of remembering, you know, that there is this correct way and everything that happened before is wrong, you know, and it shouldn't be open to debate. And then again, I think we start to get back to questions around Stepan Bandera. But since let's move on from him. I think in a way the bigger difference to me is, yes, definitely a future focus. Ukraine is a country that's focused on the future. Russia's future is essentially nostalgic anticipation. Oh, well, we can just restore the good bits that we lost. Not the only post-imperial country dealing with some of those issues, must be said. But yeah, so that's one aspect. But I think the other aspect is that Russia and many Russians, of course not all, but many Russians have quite an essentialist view of history and of nationhood, in that sense that, you know, there is this essence, and that is what makes a nation, and you have to kind of uncover the history, and that history proves the essence, and then you defend that history at all costs. Whereas what we see in Ukraine is actually it's a civic nation. And that's something obviously that Russia could not achieve, didn't especially try that hard to achieve, must be said. But I find it fascinating. I think about this a lot, as in, what is the difference between, you know, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and what happened, because particularly Ukraine and Russia had very, very ghastly 1990s. Perhaps Belarus did too. I just really don't know so much about Belarus, if I'm honest. And yet Kuchma didn't stand for a third term because there were protests. And then you had the Orange Revolution, and bluntly, it failed. Yeah, it didn't. It was incredibly disillusioning. And yet people still came out for Euromaidan, and that too could have petered out, except that the police were very, very violent, and therefore the Belgrade were very, very violent, and then that brought people out, and that's, I suppose, what made it not a Euromaidan but a revolution of dignity. And you see similar processes. I mean, I was there for I was there in Moscow, and I was in St. Petersburg during the protests. And it's funny because I was talking with somebody yesterday, a Ukrainian. We're talking about how it's not fair to expect heroism of Russians. And I said, well, I certainly can't, because when the Bolotno protests were happening, I nearly ended up like in a sort of being taken off, like in a ring. I was in a ring by the OMON, the sort of riot police, and I immediately was like, oh no, I'm a tourist. I just came, pretended I didn't speak a word of Russian. I completely, was such a coward. So I 100% have no right to ask anything of anybody.
But also, if you've seen the OMON at work, they are extremely brutal, bullying characters. I mean, they're nasty, nasty pieces of work, and they're trained to inflict extreme violence. So I don't blame you at all for that.
Well, I'll do it again. It's not, but it's just, they were picking on old women, and I guess I was very young, on young looking women, but so that says a lot about their character. They're not called the Oman anymore, but in any case, I do find it just interesting. What was that difference? And there's lots of discussions that can be had, and of course, history and maybe a certain level of pathway dependence, or the memories, what myths are used to inspire. But it's a fascinating question.
Well, let's go back to the roots of this, because, of course, the Soviet Union was very adept at mythologizing and weaponizing memory. Obviously, there was a very clear ideological purpose to that. So, certain inconvenient facts are swept away, certain things that supported that ideological narrative were kept. we perhaps had the impression in the 90s that had gone away. I'm no longer convinced that memory politics disappeared. It was just in abeyance for a while, a little bit like the strength of the FSB. And the KGB checker never went away. They were just less powerful, intrusive for a period. Where do you perceive, or when do you perceive, that memory politics really started to kick in again or intensify? Is it already pre-Putin or under Putin?
It's an interesting question. So, sorry, again, it's 2 points. So one is that I think that what you had, that in a way, what we see with this type of memory politics is, I understand it as almost like a form of illiberal memory, just like you have this illiberal backlash to liberalism, or that sort of the dominance of a particular type of liberalism. Alongside that view, you had this concept, that history is going to end, and that memory is basically about coming to terms with one's past. You admit all the bad things you did, and then you become a better country, and then that's how everybody's going to achieve this sort of reconciliation. And bluntly, that has not happened. That's something that we can see perhaps that unites lots of countries that might not have much else in common. So that's sort of one aspect, is that I think in a way the return of memory politics in such a strong way, yet in part it's because history sort of replaces ideology as a way of saying, and you're talking about religion, and ideology basically replaced religion, so it does carry these elements, but also it kind of grew in response to a dissatisfaction with maybe the liberal memory paradigm that's like, oh, it's all sorted, there's nothing you can do. A bit like discussions of globalization was like, well, it's happened. And then a lot of people are, well, I don't like that it happened. So when they had a chance to protest about it. Did memory politics go anywhere under Yeltsin? So definitely Victory Day, although he returned certain kind of trappings, definitely Victory Day, from my understanding of sort of, and this comes from interviews with people, because obviously I didn't attend Victory Day in the 1990s, it had a different emphasis. It was still an emphasis on sadness and remembering, as opposed to what we see particularly since 2014. And that shift has been very well documented, for example, by Lisa Kaufman. That shift from, oh, just don't let there be war, to we can do it again. These are quite different objectives. So that's one aspect. So I'm not saying certainly Yeltsin struggled with the Soviet holidays, but with World War II, the memory was such that you were always going to have to do something. And then when he really struggled to find a national idea, it's perhaps inevitable that he would return to it somewhat. But it didn't have that, didn't have quite that it didn't have anywhere near the militarism that it has now, or that kind of element.
That's right. Well, I remember I went to a few. It was in Petersburg, so they tend to be a little more, I wouldn't say genteel, but and certainly it seemed to be much more of a sort of family holiday, an excuse for a piss up, basically.
That's what this is what comes up again and again. So I was interested.
The scary one though was the one which was the Armed Forces Day. I mean, that's the one where you wouldn't want to be on the streets.
It's terrifying.
Terrifying. Yeah, I was in Gorky Park and I looked very disheveled. Fortunately, as a student, I looked quite sort of Russian and I could kind of blend in. But if you were an obvious tourist, it was extremely dangerous. I mean, there was this story of the special forces, they have the little blue and white striped shirts. They parachuted down into Gorky Park, and the rumor is, they uncorked a bottle of vodka as they jumped out of the plane, and by the time they hit the bottom, they'd necked the whole bottle, and they went around looking for people to beat up. So there was certainly that
fun day,
fun times, yes. But certainly, they didn't seem to be the edge to some of these holidays that perhaps they attained, and also not fully organic, because of course, as you say, there's a state TV apparatus and so on, and everyone gets behind it. But that's morphed into something different, hasn't it? Historic narratives, I think you've written very eloquently about how historic narratives, once they're sort of crafted and molded, they're then reinforced through multiple media, whether that be films, TV interviews, propagandists. They're translated into multiple voices. So you get this polyphony that is essentially saying the same thing, but it gives you the illusion of diversity. And the question here really is, rather than being historical dialogue, that more resembles perhaps a kind of religious catechism. I don't know if you think that's...
I haven't thought of that, but I think it's a fair point. It's a very interesting point. Yeah, I'd need to think on it. Probably, it certainly doesn't represent historical dialogue. You do get historical dialogue on some points, which is one of the reasons why it's intensified, because, you know, as we've sort of had this Overton window of what is acceptable. So we've had recent, I mean, in 2010, Putin offered, you know, an official apology for Katyn, for the Soviet shooting of Polish officers. And now Katyn has its Polish flags removed and it's being denied again. There was some suspiciously timed new archival evidence that showed that actually the Soviet Union didn't do it. I think during a very recent, well, of course, I mean, spat isn't the word, but during another sort of flare up of the ongoing diplomatic conflict between Russia and Poland. So for me, what I find interesting about the ubiquity of memory is in the way that it's put into children's after school clubs, stationery sets, metro carriages, themed metro carriages, of course, school lessons themselves increasingly now, whereas previously, actually, school history tended to not be quite so politicized, interestingly. The way it's there in the media and the way that it's there on the street murals, of course, in the various different types of, oh, today is the day when we remember the lawyers in the Great Patriotic War. Today is the day when we remember the dogs in the Great Patriotic War.
The bread makers.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I find that interesting because you just have this constant reinforcement where essentially it's always there, and then it becomes a unifying thing for generations, you know, who were born, you know, many years after the end of the Great Patriotic War, because it's always there, and it also becomes a part of, I suppose, it's a ritual. And then it becomes part of it becomes a practice, part of an ideology, because defending the memory, remembering the Great Patriotic War is a political act in Russia. It's been incredibly politicized. So rather than just going to commemorate your loved ones, it's become part of a geopolitical stance. You wear the St. George's ribbon, you defend the memory of the Great Patriotic War, and you support aggression in Ukraine. Maybe not to the extent of the full-scale invasion, but certainly in 2014.
And there's been an effort to link those two, hasn't there? There's a distinct effort to label the Ukrainian war as a new patriotic war. Is everyone buying into that? Or do you think some people perhaps see that as a step too far? Or perhaps those who are closer in time to the Great Patriotic War and, you know, may have a direct connection via their parents or even as children?
So no, on the whole, I don't think people buy it, the sense that it's a new Great Patriotic War, because clearly the fighting is not in Russia. I mean, that's why it's still a special military operation, ultimately. I mean, it's not a special military operation, that's why it's still called that. And so that's one aspect. But I think that people, I mean, in Russia in general, among ordinary Russians, where it's just been grassroots elements, because that's obviously what a lot of my fieldwork was on. I was kind of speaking to people who set up quite a lot of these kind of military history clubs, military history camps, and trying to understand their ambitions, and often with quite a lot of them, how they ended up somehow being co-opted by the government for political use. You know, was that something because they shared the aim? And almost all of the time, their narratives were pretty similar to the Kremlin's of actually what happened in the past. They didn't have that kind of political use often, but, you know, it was quite apolitical kind of approach to history. But and they were pretty skeptical. They knew what the government was doing, and they didn't like it, because nobody likes having their most sacred memories, you know, used as sort of tawdry PR material. So that said, certain aspects of the narrative and the way it's been employed, they are very popular, because realistically, the notion, okay, fighting in Ukraine is just like the Great Patriotic War, that's actually quite a rare comparison, even in 2014, and especially now, though it's more a call to the heroism. Okay, like this is your version, you know, to be inspired by it, and the sense of defending it, because ultimately, again, this links into a bigger geopolitical picture, which is in Russia's view, which is that Russia has a right, it's an inherent right, because Russia is a special civilization, all of this, but also it proved and it paid for that right when the Soviet Union won in 1945. And therefore, people trying to destroy the memory of World War II, which also includes just not letting Russia have a sphere of influence in the countries that it occupied, they are trying to destroy Russian identity, Russia's right to exist, you know, all of these different elements. So there are so many different directions that it goes off into, but the core point is that the notion that Ukraine is not respecting the memory of World War II, that is reasonably widespread, but to the extent that I'm not sure how many people genuinely really care about it. What is more worrying is that people do seem, including liberals, to have swallowed at least partly the notion that those in power in Ukraine are nationalists. And you know, sort of apologists of Bandera, which is quite a stretch to say of Zelensky.
It's a significant stretch, isn't it? And it, of course, purposefully, you know, ignores any of the nuance. It, as you said earlier in the conversation, it prevents a more open and objective discussion of the bad bits of history. And let's be honest, I mean, Ukraine has got some pretty dark points in its history, as has Britain, as has Poland, as has every other country in Europe. If you really wanted to pick it apart and point to the worst bits, you know, no country pretty much would be immune from that process. I think that is it only the Czechs who haven't you know, committed genocide in their history, and there's some. You know, I'm sure we find some little nationality somewhere who've been kind to their neighbours for 10,000 years, but that's a bit of a rarity.
I feel like the Finns would have been kind. I don't know anything about Finnish history, but I feel like they would have.
I don't think they've ever done anything bad to anyone. I think they've just got on with their sort of fishing and whatever. But taking your point there, I mean, this paranoia that really sits at the heart of it, the exceptionalism, the paranoia that has turned Russia again into a sort of fortress mentality. Now, the geopolitical realist might say that these are genuine things, and that and all this stuff about historical memory comes from a genuine place, and it comes from a place of real pain, real facts, real suffering, sacrifice, etc., etc. But that is kind to ignore the sort of little local truth, which is that the architect of a lot of this, Vladislav Surkov, is very consciously a kind of post-truth, postmodern kind of figure. You have to wonder whether, you know, he genuinely feels or believes any of this stuff, or whether it's all kind of material for him to create you know, an alternative reality, a reality that can be used to manipulate for political purposes. I think we can forget that all of this stuff is architected by people, and it costs a lot of money and effort to create, and therefore it's not done for no reason. It's done for a strategic objective. I don't know what your thoughts are on the architects of this sort of historical process.
The memory makers, I suppose.
Yeah. The memory makers themselves. Yeah.
So Surkov, it was not especially. I mean, of course, he was influential, so he still has some role, but he wasn't really one of the main ones around the memory makers. First of all, a lot of it was just Medinsky, and everyone was like, all right, calm down, you know, like with his, quite a few times he was asked to sort of rewrite things or like taken off things. But you also had Sergei Naryshkin, Shoigu is also very interested, I mean, in geography and history, actually, but so in 2012, it was the year of history in Russia, and that was the year when everything really became formalized. A lot of laws had already been passed. For example, the United Russia project, which is historical memory, which goes across, you know, to kind of the country to instill certain vision and to make people kind of reconnect with, to make history engaging, I suppose, or their version of history engaging. That was actually set up in 2007, but nothing happened until 2012. And then Sergei Narishkin, who's also the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, he wasn't at the time, he is now, began to head it up. So you have pretty senior figures involved. In terms of the realist vision, to be honest with you, I think it's a shame that realists don't engage a bit more with these kind of memory and identity insecurity. I know it's more typical, identity is more typically seen as something constructivist, but I think there's something really interesting. I mean, obviously, Maria Malkso has worked on sort of that sense of insecurity, and there's a really good book about Serbia actually by Philip Adis, and why Serbia doesn't follow what's in its national interest because of the importance of Serbia to its kind of sense of itself. But I mean, even if it does feel that way, why is that Ukraine's problem? That's Russia's problem. You see, why does there have to be certain norms that we respect? And certainly the West hasn't always respected them. So I don't, it's not like we can just blame like the dissolution of any kind of vague rules respected order on Russia, though this has been an especially egregious form. But I think Russia probably does feel very insecure. But why on earth should that mean that it gets to take bits of Ukraine? I mean, that's the logic I don't really kind of understand. To me, that just means, oh, okay, fair. I think that Russia does believe quite a lot, or, the Russian government do believe quite a lot of these elements. They've shown it. I mean, for so long, we had people saying, oh, no, what they really mean when they say this. Like, no, I think they just mean that. I appreciate it sounds mental to you, but I think they just mean that because that's then what they went on to do. And to me, it's just, okay, we need to understand that, we need to take it seriously, and then we need to think, how does each country protect its own kind of national interest, or the national interests of its allies? And to me, that clearly would suggest that there needs to be a very credible deterrence, because there's going to be a whole new vision of Russia needed if you want Russia to give up its designs on Ukraine.
And I think that probably gets to the heart of it. And it's a question I'm going to be asking at it's a core question, actually, of the series of interviews I've done with Chatham House experts. And that is that essentially, yes, Russia probably does feel incredibly insecure, but that is not from an outside threat, unless it's modernity as a sort of, abstract concept. And that's, I guess, because the Russian identity is intrinsically linked to an imperial concept. And actually, that multinational empire may not collapse tomorrow, but inherently that model is antiquated and it is extremely fragile. And I think this is something the Russian leaders are acutely aware of, is that unforeseen things can happen, and that model of the multinational empire built on a relatively poor economy is inherently fragile. I don't know whether you think that is actually the cause of the anxiety, but it is projected out onto Ukraine, it's projected onto us, it's projected onto others, but really it's more of an internal identity issue.
Yes, I think there's a deep, what I would call ontological insecurity, or a deep kind of insecurity about what Russia is. Is Russia a nation? And it's interesting because I think you get this in quite a few post-imperial countries, certainly with Castilians in Spain, with the English in the UK, there are certain parallels to be drawn. But ultimately, again and again, you get to this point where Russia has a chance to create something better domestically, or sort of an opportunity, and yet it then turns to actually proving its greatness. After a while, that path of improvement comes to an end for different reasons. And its desire to prove its greatness returns back to extending its borders abroad. So, because then I suppose as well, it's a distraction. It's a distraction from the fact of what is Russia? Why is Russia a nation? Who is Russian? Why do ethnic Russians have this state-forming role? There are all of these questions that, admittedly, are very hard questions, and I wish future Russian generations all the best of luck dealing with them. But Ukraine can't be sacrificed because Russia has an identity problem.
It's a can of worms, isn't it? And I got the impression, certainly in the 90s, that it's a can of worms people really don't want to open. And it's a very big can of worms when you take everything into consideration. And one of the persistent things that I heard from individual Russians who don't, as you know, don't necessarily understand or get involved in politics, and that was like, if we're so great, why are our lives so shit? Why are we so poor? Why don't things work? Why do these Germans live better than us? It was our empire. Why do our subject peoples seem to do better out of it than we do? And that, I guess, is the fundamental problem. And maybe one we could explore in a future episode is why Russia's entity does not benefit its people. And that's something eventually when I guess they do examine it, it's going to be extremely painful and a bitter kind of examination for people to realize that.
Yeah, I think I mean there's a lot of big questions in there. I think I can just agree it will be bitter.
We could save that for another episode, I think. Yeah. It's a teaser for the next one. Jade, it's been a huge pleasure once more to speak to you. I strongly recommend people read your books. I think they're both essential for an understanding of what is going on. And you don't try to sort of impose artificial solutions on those. You let the sort of voices come out from your research. I think it's one of the most nuanced pieces of work and incredibly important. Thank you so much for sharing that on the channel.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.